Welcome to another episode of the Zealous Podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. Be sure to follow us on Instagram so you can get little clips of the shows. That's at Rocky_Snyder for Instagram. This week I have Sudip Bagui, the physical performance coach with the Seattle Sounders. He's really working with developing the young athletes and hopes that they will reach the MLS level. I hope you enjoy the show. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episode that we put out every week on Mondays at 6 a.m. Pacific, 9 a.m. Eastern. So, Sudip, thanks for being on. First of all, I'm really excited to talk about all things soccer and all things strength conditioning, but I'd love to hear what your path has been like. Like, where did you start off? Where did you go to? And where are you now?
Yeah, so it's been of a kind of a winding-ish path over the past few years. The first thing I would say is anything that I am right now is a direct result of the input and sort of the work that my mentors have put into me. So like I wouldn't be anything without them. But I kind of ended up, so I started off and I was undergrad at UF, and just like anybody in an APK major or applied physiology major, I wanted to go into physical therapy or some sort of pre-professional school, but I didn't really know for sure if that's what I wanted. I felt like that was what I wanted to do because a lot of other people were doing it. So I was doing a lot of PT volunteer hours. And at the time I was like, okay, I'm set on doing this. I think I'm going to do this. 2017 rolls around. It's my last year. And I think to myself, well, I want to work in sports physical therapy, but I already have a lot of hours in PT in terms of volunteering. And as an undergrad, they're not going to let me do anything more in a clinic. If I do my last semester internship, most programs generally have an internship at the end of their program requirements, just to kind of like top off whatever you learned in a practical setting. So I thought, most clinics are not really going to use a volunteer intern at an undergrad level at a very, very high level. So I thought, there's other ways that I can make myself set apart for PT school application, especially if I want to go into sports. So I thought, okay, let me try to find a strength conditioning internship. So maybe I can learn a little bit more, carry it into PT. So I applied to University of Florida strength conditioning internship, met Matt Delancey. He accepted me. And from then on, it just kept going, to be completely honest. I went in and I was like, wow, this is fantastic. And Matt really tested me. He taught me a lot of stuff. Both, in terms of strength conditioning and outside of it. So I'm forever indebted to him for giving me that first opportunity. But, once I was there, I was like, wow, this is really fun. Maybe I can do another internship and try to learn a little bit more before I go to PT school. And then I just kept pushing it back and back and back. So after UF, I went to the NSCA world headquarters to do an internship with Scott Caulfield, which again was a fantastic experience. I learned a lot about working with tactical population. I started working with hockey a little bit, which was a really cool experience. I really enjoyed that.
Was this in Colorado Springs or where were you?
Colorado Springs, yes.
Colorado Springs, all right.
Yes. So that was also a great experience, just learning from Scott Caulfield, a brilliant coach, a brilliant mentor. And then following that, I thought, okay, I still want to keep learning more. But I still had this in the back of my mind, sort of a PT sort of desire/lean. And so I thought, okay, where am I going to learn about strength conditioning, but also have a little bit of that sort of knowledge or sort of the interplay between the two infused. And the one person, I guess, or internship experience that I was looking for that really, really stood out to me was Cressey Sports Performance. And so I applied to that one. I was fortunate enough to get it with them. I was really glad they gave me that opportunity because the Cressey Sports Performance internship, especially with John O'Neill at Massachusetts, was one of the best educational experiences of my life. Not only a fantastic mentor, but obviously, Eric Cressey is phenomenal. Everybody knows that. But I think one thing that is really underrated about him and that people don't really get about him is that he also hires brilliant coaches. And so I learned so much from the coaches that I was with when I was at Cressey Sports Performance. Not just about baseball, but just about movement training. But then also even more than any of that, I think I learned how to coach there. Before that, I learned about coaching in terms of, being able to tell people, giving them a specific cue and saying, okay, you're going to do it this way. But with Cressey, I got to work with a whole bunch of different people and a different population. And I learned kind of what a good coach was. And it sort of started to define in a technical aspect, at least, maybe not in a relational aspect, more in a technical aspect, is to get someone to do what you want to do. That's good coaching, right? And you have to connect with them on, on a relational basis, but then also you have to understand what goes through their mind. So for example, if I tell you to tighten your core, that may not mean anything to probably 80% of the population, because 80% of the population may not be training at a level that you and I as professionals are training at. But if I give them a specific cue that they can relate to, and that may not be the same for me as it is for you, or for a baseball player as it is for a softball player, or even between two baseball players, because they grew up differently. And it's trying to find what works for that individual to get them essentially to do what you want them to do. And I think that is a concept that transcends all of coaching, whether it's strength and conditioning, sport coaching, or even just mentorship outside of a competitive environment. So once I finished at Cressey, I realized I had to go back to grad school if I wanted to continue to work in strength and conditioning. And at that point, I kind of just realized, okay, I think I want to put the PT thing off the side a little bit. Maybe I will one day go back, but I think I'm doing decently enough in strength and conditioning to keep going and see where it takes me.
How long was your time at Cressey? How long were you there with them?
That was 5 months, January to May. Yeah.
Oh, so you got to experience winter in Massachusetts. How was that?
That was quite an experience. So when I say I had snow up to my waist a few days, I'm not exaggerating.
Yeah, there's nothing like feeling the moisture inside your nostrils freeze and hear the ice crystals crinkle, right? When you just wriggle your nose.
You described my very first day up in Massachusetts. Especially coming from Florida.
I was wondering about that when you mentioned your work with Eric. So, that's good, because I grew up. That was my youth, not far away from there in Massachusetts. So I get it. Okay, so you leave Cressey Performance and you're off to where?
So I left Cressey and I realized I need a master's degree if I want to work in college or professional sports, which it ended up being what I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, I need a master's degree. And to be quite frank, I had a few GA opportunities, but to be quite frank, the reason I went back to University of Florida is this was the cheapest location. And when you gotta spend money for college education, especially for grad school, I think it would be at least an intelligent decision to make sure that you are spending the least amount of money to do so. So when I went back to UF, and I got, when I went back for grad school, again, good education, went back to help Matt Delancey and as well as Karen Worth in the strength and conditioning department. And Karen worked with women's soccer there, and she knew that I really enjoyed soccer. So I asked her if I could, really concentrate a lot of my efforts to help them with soccer. And fortunately enough, the summer after I returned, so summer, semester, and then another summer. So the second summer, University of Florida started using a GPS system. And at the time, they didn't really, not that anybody hadn't used a GPS system before, but they didn't have someone dedicated to using that. And again, not that I was an expert at it, because at the time I wasn't, still don't consider myself, but I know a little bit more now than I did back then. I had done a little bit of research just on my own, just to learn a little bit about how other people were using GPS, workload management. I had gone to Tim Gabbett's Q Chronic workload management workshop, and I met Tim, kind of talked to him about it. I had also gone literally that summer to the Seattle Sounders Sports Science Conference. I had known Sean Muldoon for a little bit. And so, I asked him if I could go, and he gave me an invitation. So that was a good experience, just to learn from other people in MLS, but then also college soccer, how they use it. So when I came back, I was like, hey, can I help you, work with this and really kind of just make this sort of a project. So, early on, Karen gave me a lot of leeway in how I did that. She fully trusted me, which was really, I really appreciate that. And then, I started to build the trust with the coaches a little bit more. The one thing I learned about workload management, the interesting thing is when you have good coaches, they kind of already know how to do this intuitively. And so I would look at the data, and early on, you don't necessarily want to change a lot of things because you don't really know what to change. So I didn't. I just collected the information, looked at it, And then I tried to see if there was some sort of logical progression. And the coaches actually, for the most part, did a really, really good job. And I thought, there really isn't much we can change. We can talk about different things, small nuances here and there. Maybe a certain player is feeling a certain thing and we can change something for her. But overall, they already did such a good job. We didn't have to tweak very much except for a few small things. But it was just a really good experience overall to get to work with that, especially as that was my first experience. So then after Florida, I thought, while I was at Florida, I thought, okay, I need to, I had two things on my mind. Either I had to get a full-time paid position because I'm finishing up grad school, or I can find a way to break into Major League Soccer, because that at the time was my ultimate goal.
Was that because you played as a youth? Were you
yeah, I guess I didn't cover
player?
that. So yeah, I played soccer. I started like when I was 11 years old, and I just fell in love with the game. I honestly actually hated the sport before the age of 11 because my dad would make me play, and I never wanted to do anything my dad wanted me to do as a rebellious youth. But one day I was sitting, or my dad actually was sitting and watching the World Cup in 2006, and I was like super patriotic as a little kid. So he was watching the USA match. I was like, oh, great. Let me watch the USA match. And so I just fell in love with the game after that and literally probably played every single day from the age of 11 to like the age of 18. So I really enjoy the sport. And that's kind of how I ended up, falling into the sport. Never really played, at a higher level besides high school sort of adult league, but it was still just a huge passion of mine. I'm still a huge fan of the sport. Obviously I work for a soccer club now, but
yeah.
After sort of grad school, I was like, okay, what are my options? It's really hard when you're in professional sports to break into that league unless you know somebody. And so I thought I have to find a way to know somebody because yeah, you have to have high quality in terms of the work that you do. But if nobody knows about that work, then there's no way you're going to get that opportunity. And fortunately enough, I think it was in October of that year, 2019, that there was this fellowship that came up with Sporting Kansas City. And I decided, okay, I'll apply to that. It's still kind of a internship / fellowship experience, but at least it breaks me in with a club. Again, had my interview with Joey Hardy and Mike Steidel. And again, that went really well. And again, they gave me the opportunity to come in and help their club. And that was a great experience. So my role there was basically to help everybody. So primarily I helped the academy strength coach and the second team strength coach. So I basically worked with anybody from the U12s all the way up to the second division professional soccer team on any given day. And again, it was just a great experience to understand how MLS organizations work, how the performance coach does his job and works with the sport coach in planning practices, and then how we can fit in sort of ways to develop the athletes as athletes themselves while still also keeping the focus on the bigger picture is that they're trying to either get a college soccer scholarship or make it professionally. After that, obviously COVID hit 2020. And so that kind of like shut everything down. So I, again, started looking for a full-time position, had a few different opportunities, but then Army provided me an opportunity to work with women's soccer. So I thought, okay, like this is a decent opportunity, partially because I had a few opportunities at some normal schools, like, different SEC schools, but I thought, Army is different. It's got this sort of aspect. Yeah, I'm still working with soccer, but I also have to account for some other things. After doing a little bit of research, I kind of learned about some of the things that the athletes do at Army, as well as just any normal cadet does at Army. And so,
well, you also had your background of tactical strength conditioning a little bit with the NSCA headquarters there. So that makes complete sense. I'm just curious though, how did you find out about West Point? Was there like some job board or how do you?
Yeah, as you may know, and as I'm sure some of your listeners know, if they're applying to jobs in strength conditioning, you kind of have to apply to a lot of different things, especially on your first time try to get it. So frankly, I saw it on the CSCCA job board. And I was like, all right, well, full-time position, it says sports science. So I'm imagining it has something to do with either soccer or basketball, one of the sports, at least that uses that stuff in college athletics more strongly. So I applied. They told me it was a soccer job. So I was like, all right, let's keep going. So I kept going and going and going. And again, Scott Swanson provided me an opportunity to work with his athletes. And I was like, great, this is fantastic. So that was how I ended up full-time at West Point. And then that, to be honest, that was one of the biggest learning experiences in my life in terms of having sort of my ideas of one, load management, but then also strength conditioning kind of changed a little bit.
How so? What do you mean?
It was a situation where I guess a good practical example is this. So I went in there saying, okay, there's certain ways to do things based on a lot of the experiences that I have, as well as the advice that I was given to by my mentors and things that I'd seen work, as well as a lot of stuff based on research, right? And I went in. So an example would be, let's say someone is experiencing extension-based low back pain. It's a common issue in, tactical populations. It's a common issue in different sports, whatever. So I had a few athletes that were experiencing, a good number actually. When I came in, they were telling me they were experiencing low back pain, and it always happened when they extended their low back. I was like, okay, let's do, instead of a back squat that'll load your spine, let's do a trap bar deadlift. And I thought also to myself, well, trap bar deadlift is in the ACFT, so this is great experience for them. That was actually a terrible decision. So the way I teach trap bar deadlift is I teach it sort of in a vertical pattern as a squat. Not necessarily to say that a hinge pattern is, or a dominant hinge pattern is wrong. It's just, if I was to apply that, if I was to prescribe a hinge type of trap bar deadlift, I might as well give them a barbell RDL. It's basically the same movement. I'm just using a different implement. So the reason I teach it as a vertical sort of squat type pattern is to limit the range of motion a little bit. So if they have limitations in range of motion that they can't reach in a back squat, I can still get sort of a vertical force production pattern while, staying out of ranges of motion that may be troublesome for some people. Okay, so let's try that. Terrible idea, as I said, because a lot of these athletes had been predisposed to sort of an extension-based pattern, no matter what movement they did. So I was like, okay, well, let me try to coach them out of it. And I used every trick in the book, every trick that I learned that I just said, I learned at Cressey, I learned it with Matt Delancey, with his corrective exercise stuff, everything. Nothing worked. Still back pain. Okay. So what am I going to do? Well, some of these athletes are asking me to back squat. What if I just give them a back squat? All right. So I gave them a back squat. No pain whatsoever. And I was like, wow, this is very fascinating. Some people that I thought, after years of experience, research, mentorship, that would be terrible candidates for back squatting, extreme extensor-based low back pain, just all these other issues. Actually, they were great candidates for back squatting. And so I thought, wow, that's, this is a situation where, I may leave West Point and, what I had learned previously may go completely back into effect. But this sort of population, they're used to certain things, and they built a tolerance to certain things. And I think just that plays into a lot of what we think about training. And I think sometimes, I think of myself as one of the most technical coaches, and sometimes my predispositions, are just wrong. And I need to accept that and learn from my athletes as well. So kind of things like that, in terms of workload management, in terms of, honestly, the resilience, because a lot of these kids did so much other stuff besides just playing soccer and lifting weights. And I was really impressed and, interested to see how they were able to manage all of that while still, providing a product in terms of training and then in terms of competing. So that was, a fantastic experience again there, just learning from all the athletes, learning from all the coaches and stuff there.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned ACFT, which I don't know if the listening audience knows what that's about, but as a strength conditioning coach at West Point, you've got more than sport-specific conditioning and periodization of soccer to consider. What do these cadets, or students, however you'd like to label them, what else do they have to be contending with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Uh, there's a few different things. So every person in the Army, I'm sure most people in the audience at least have some idea of when you're in the Army, you have to do some sort of fitness test. So the fitness test used to be sit-ups, push-ups, and a 2-mile run, and then maybe like one other thing. They revised the fitness test in recent years to make it a little bit more, I hate to use the word functional, but it's a little bit more specific to targeting other aspects of physiology rather than just endurance, which is basically what a bunch of sit-ups, push-ups, and 2-mile run is. So there still is a 2-mile run, but then there's also the trap bar deadlift to measure strength. There's an overhead med ball toss for power. There's a sled drag / carry, I believe. And then there's one other test, which I'm forgetting right now. I think there's a core assessment test. It used to be the leg tucks, but now it's sort of a plank / leg tuck combination. So basically it just measures and ranks people based on different aspects of fitness rather than just endurance. So the cadets have to be ready for that when they enter the Army. So they take it periodically during their time at West Point so they can continue to improve their scores so that when they're in the Army, they can be ready for it. So generally speaking, they'll take it at the bookends of either semester. So either at the start of the semester or at the end of the semester. And with an athlete, if an NCAA athlete, it kind of depends on when their championship season is. So certain teams may choose to just do it at the beginning of their season, so they don't have to worry about it at the end of the season. Or they may just do it at the end of their championship season. So they have a few weeks to prepare after they finish their conference tournament, and then just go into it, complete it. Then they have their non-championship season. So it kind of just depends on the team, but generally it's 1 to 3 times a year.
So how did that affect you with your program design for these soccer athletes that had to go and do something else? I mean, because typically you are training for specificity of events, and now you've got 2 that aren't necessarily similar.
For sure. So to me, well, kind of going back on terms of the specificity, I am training in terms of specificity, but at the same time, I'm not. In terms of the way I think of training and development, especially for younger athletes, I think at times we overuse the word specificity. Anything that I do in training, if I'm not using a soccer ball, and if I'm not playing 11v11 soccer, it's not really specific to what I'm trying to get on the field. And I think in training in general, specificity is not necessarily overused, but like people dive a little bit too deeply in the sense of that everything has to be specific to training. Because if you really think about training, you don't want to be specific. Anything, whether it's sport practice or strength conditioning practice, anything we do is non-specific to the actual game, unless you are playing the actual game. So an example would be, let's say a soccer coach wants to prepare his team for a match on Saturday. At some point in the week, there's going to be some sort of small-sided game. Now, if you really think about a small-sided game, it isn't specific to 11v11 soccer. 3v3 soccer is nothing like 11v11. The physical requirements are different. The technical requirements are different. It's a completely different game. However, you get certain parts of 11v11 in 3v3 to elicit a certain effect. So the certain effect is maybe physically I'm trying to get a little bit more muscular power, muscular endurance, changes of direction, acceleration, deceleration, whatever. The technical effects, maybe now I'm trying to help the athlete improve their ability in 1v1. Okay, so you're extracting a part of a whole to get a certain effect so that eventually it transfers into what you want to achieve in the big picture. And I think of sort of strength conditioning in the same way. So kind of addressing that in terms of specificity. Now, with the ACFT, the way they've revised it, in my opinion, every human being should be able to do it after a certain period of training and do well, and especially any NCAA athlete. So for me, it was kind of creating an expectation for a lot of these athletes that, look, we're going to trap bar deadlift in training, whether it was in your ACFT or not, because it's an effective movement. Now, if it wasn't in their ACFT and I had a situation, let's say an athlete did better with their back for back squat than trap bar deadlift, I would probably back squat them. But again, because it is a part of their ACFT, it's an important component in your training program because you have to be ready. Now, there are certain sort of requirements. So let's say, I believe for men, if you get 340 on your trap bar deadlift, you get the maximum number of points. So each sort of grade has a number of points that you could be assigned. So it was always an expectation for the athletes that I worked with. If you're not maxing out, your goal is not to max out your points. So an example would be if an athlete can only trap bar deadlift 200 and the maximum is 340 pounds to get the maximum number of points, there's no shot for you to get 340 pounds in 6 weeks. So that's not what we're trying to do, because over the course of the West Point cadet's career, you still have 8 to 10 more attempts at the ACFT. And the goal is by the time you enter the Army, you're at your highest point. It's not to be at your highest point in 6 weeks. And that was a very important point to make to some of these athletes, because one, obviously they're young and they want to strive to be better. And they're also very high achieving. They come from high achieving academic and athletic backgrounds. They want to be really successful at everything that they do. But the other thing is they look at a lot of other people, because they take the ACFT all together, with large groups of people. So they see like, oh, look, this football player is trap bar deadlifting, 300 pounds so easily. I have to do that too. And it's like, no, you don't have to do that. I'm not saying you can't trap bar deadlift 300 pounds. You absolutely can, but we need to train up to it. If you haven't done it before, it makes no sense to do that, to make a 100-pound jump in your training now. So that was kind of important to break through to these athletes. In terms of sort of the overall planning training process, the movements were kind of filtered into the training program little by little. So if there were movements that I considered staples that allowed them to achieve certain training effects more effectively, they would probably be in the training program more frequently. So an example would be trap bar deadlift was in the training program a lot more frequently than maybe like a 2-mile run. Because a lot of their conditioning already came from soccer and practice.
Sure.
So I didn't really need to train that directly. Or for example, like push-ups, weighted push-ups, eccentric, all that kind of stuff was in the training program a lot more frequently, because, I could push up, I could bench press. It's basically the same thing. But like an example that was not in the training program as frequently, but it was kind of an accessory exercise so they could get small exposures to it, would be like a leg tuck. So a leg tuck is basically like you're holding a pull-up bar in the air, and then you have to bring your knees up to your elbows, and that counts as one. And if you don't get it all the way up, then you don't get the point. So like that was an exercise I put in sort of as an accessory to a lot of my teams, kind of as a core quote unquote exercise. I kind of put it in that block, I guess, just to get them to think about that as that. But it wasn't like, all right, we're going to focus on this specific day. It was just something that we filtered in a little bit so they could practice regularly, so that when they got to the exam, they would have some confidence doing the movement.
Yeah, that's definitely different than your average college level NCAA soccer athletes. It adds a new element. Okay, so I want to spin this in the direction of the Seattle Sounders, because eventually the end, not with I won't say the end of your story, but where you are currently is you are with the Seattle Sounders. You got yourself a nice gig going on there, and you're developing the younger athletes in the hopes of getting them prepared to hopefully be recruited up to the MLS level. What is that like?
Yeah, so Seattle Sounders, it's similar in the sense of, to Sporting Kansas City, in the sense of these athletes want to make it professionally. With the focus is always to get these athletes to sign for the first team for Seattle Sounders. Now, my dream would be that every single one of my athletes does do that, but the reality of the situation is that very few of them will. Not simply because it's challenging to make it in professional sports, let alone Major League Soccer level, but also at the Seattle Sounders, as one of the more successful clubs in Major League Soccer and really in all of North America. It is a challenging proposition for any person to make it to the first team. So for me, yes, it is important to develop them in the long term for that, but it's also important to keep in the big picture where a lot of these athletes may be going. A lot of these athletes will likely sign scholarships for, or letters of intent for college soccer. And that's still a great piece of their development because, in an ideal world, if they do go to college soccer, they come back and, maybe they sign a contract through the draft with Seattle Sounders. That's in an ideal world if they do go to college. And there was one athlete actually recently like that, Dylan Tevez. I believe he's with the academy previously, played for University of Washington, was drafted with the Seattle Sounders. But there's not, but even if, they don't sign for the Sounders, it's important also still to keep in mind that we're still in the business of developing athletes in the long term so that they can be successful wherever they go. Whether that's maybe for another club, whether it's just for college soccer. So for me, the emphasis is still a sort of teaching environment. So a big part of this development is movement quality. So whether that's on the field or even off the field, whether that's in the weight room. So if they step into a weight room, a lot of these athletes, especially if they're in the U15s, this is their first time ever stepping into a weight room. And, I meet a 14-year-old kid. I don't know whether he's going to sign for the Seattle Sounders first team or if he's going to just stop playing soccer after college and just go into a gym and, do whatever he needs to. Or if he, when he steps foot into a collegiate weight room, can he be confident with a collegiate strength and conditioning coach, knowing what he needs to do when a collegiate strength and conditioning coach teaches him. So I think for this 14-year-old kid, it's my job to teach him, okay, what are the basics of effective and appropriate lifting? How can we do this throughout the week? And why do I plan things the way I plan them? So that if for some reason you ever have to do this on your own after college or after, whatever situation, the basics and you have an understanding of it. And then that's also outside of the weight room. How can I, in terms of stuff outside of the weight room on the field, in terms of movement development, a lot of that may be just general athletic development. So how to change direction, how to turn your hips, how to accelerate, how to sprint at top speed, all those kinds of things. One, obviously, all those things are going to be effective in helping to develop a soccer player, but also it's just general athletic development, right? So, again, like I said, if I'm not with a ball, it's not specific to soccer.
Yeah. Now you've got different age levels, obviously, and the way in which it's bracketed or separated is typically with chronological age, where you've got U14, U16, U18, and the like. Some clubs obviously are going to have more groups, and others may have less. But the question here is, you've got an athlete that has a physical maturity level beyond their chronological age, or also mental maturity. And then you've got maybe other athletes that are not physically mature as their chronological age, or for that matter, mentally mature. How does that come into play? Do you tend to, like, as we call it, like coaching, do you play up or do you bring them down? Or do you just keep them in that age bracket and then have to address those elements within the group that they're currently in? Does that make sense?
That's a fantastic, that makes complete sense. Great question. And it's actually something I currently am dealing with since I basically started here 2 months ago. So in terms of physical maturity, so as you said, there are some athletes that, they may be 14 years chronologically, but biologically they may be quote unquote 16 years because they've hit their growth spurt early. In those situations, so as I'm starting out, this first 2 months, for me, it's just establishing a standard for everything that we do. Now, like I said, you can individualize certain things for certain people, as I did, at previous organizations. So, maybe at West Point, we may have had 5 different lifts for one team going on at the same time. But that's only because the first 4-ish months I had established, okay, these are the main emphasis points when we're squatting, when we're lunging, when we're doing a push-up, when we're sprinting. And it may look different for different people, but these are the small things to think about when you do them. This is that sort of phase for me right now here at the Seattle Sounders. So, this is a basic way everyone should look like when they're squatting. Now, obviously, some people may toe out a little bit. Some people may have their feet completely straight. Some people may hit this depth. Some people may hit that depth, and we'll make those adjustments as we go. But overall, this is the archetype archetype for what a certain movement or certain types of movements should look like. And I'm establishing that now. Now, as I get to know these athletes more individually, I can say, okay, we're going to change this for this person, and we're going to change this for this person. In terms of their biological maturity, we do PHV measurements. So we measure height, weight, and then basically we can get an idea of when they might hit their growth spurt, and theoretically what their sort of bandwidth in terms of how tall they could be, or how tall they may not be, whatever that bandwidth is. So we measured that and see, okay, at what point is a person hitting their peak height velocity, or quote unquote, their growth spurt? And if they are getting closer to that, it's a little bit more about managing sort of their overall workload. So whether that's in the weight room or even on the field, we can measure workload with our GPS for all of our players. So it's kind of just talking to the coaches, and letting them know, hey, like, just so you know, this player is kind of in that phase of his development where we need to be a little bit more careful in terms of how much we throw at him. So maybe, for certain athletes, we may say, look, we're going to modify certain things, whether it's on the field or in the weight room, in terms of giving them maybe a day off, or maybe, if a certain athlete has 2 training sessions because they may train with multiple teams, maybe we only train him on 1 training session so we can make sure that he's not doing too much. And so kind of, taking it player by player and sort of month by month and saying, okay, this is what we need to do for this player so they can maximize the development in the long term.
Yeah, that sounds like you say, long-term athletic development, LTAD. We're hearing that, for the last decade or so, really being pushed. And it's great, because that means that we're actually not just having this treadmill or an assembly line effect for whatever the age is. This is what we're throwing at them. My question there, Sudip, is that if you've got somebody that is at their peak height velocity, they've hit that growth spurt, do you start to tweak the program in a way, which I think you already alluded to, but in regards to like mobility, when the skeletal frame is growing at a greater rate than the muscle tissue is allowing, we're going to have those long, lanky, kind of inflexible athletes. Is that when you start to throw in mobility? Are there times in this peak velocity curve that you're looking at, okay, this is the opportunity for coordination and balance, this is the time for fundamental strength, this is the time for coordination, mobility, whatever? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, kind of. What you kind of alluded to, in the sense of, this is a certain window of opportunity for this quality, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's talked about in a lot of sort of long-term athletic development, I guess, graphs or like infographics and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But to be quite honest, for me, some of the qualities that you mentioned are things, and I think you would agree with me on this, are things that basically any training program can address, whether that's for 15 to 18-year-old athletes or 50 to 80-year-old athletes, right? Mobility, coordination, those types of things are things that anybody can work on. And maybe not everybody needs to improve necessarily, but have regular exposures to, so they can maintain. So, doing and teaching them, for example, effective methods of soft tissue, whether that's trigger point, foam rolling, that type of stuff, exposures to that can be done, whether that's, a 15-year-old athlete or a 50-year-old athlete, like I said, or a professional athlete or a college athlete. And it's something that they're going to do at some point anyway. So whether or not, I know in strength conditioning and PT and all these other worlds, people say whether it's effective or not. Well, frankly speaking, whether it is effective or not, people are going to do it. So you might as well teach them effective ways to do it. So that's kind of the way I think of that. And in terms of coordination, coordination is essentially just like, executing certain movement patterns and having effective timing to be able to do so, whether that's in a sporting environment or outside of it. In a sporting environment is simply just a little bit more chaotic, because you don't really know whether an opponent is going to do something else or not. And in a non-sporting environment, it's a lot less chaotic, so you can teach them certain patterns there. But at the end of the day, a hip hinge is a hip hinge, whether you're a 15-year-old athlete or a 25-year-old athlete. And
well, there goes my next, that's my next question. Sorry to interrupt, but you just mentioned 15 and 25. You've had experience with age ranges. And so I'm wondering about your coaching style. Like at West Point, you you started to develop a certain style of coaching. And I'm reminded of Nick Winkelman, who I had on a couple months ago. He wrote The Art of Coaching, and his thing was coming up with analogies. And you mentioned it earlier, like when people have a different idea of when you say tighten up your core, some people won't even know what that means. Others will do it improperly. So you've got to create imagery and analogies and so on. I'm just wondering, is that your approach to coaching, especially with the youth? Like, how do you coach something that is new to a lot of athletes and it's going to be with them for a long time? You're laying the bedrock, the fundamental foundation for strength and conditioning if they continue on for the rest of their life. Not to put that too much emphasis, like a big weight on your shoulder, but how do you do that?
For sure. And I think some of the way I coach goes directly back to my internship at CSP. So I think there's a few things basic tools that I use. So one, obviously you can explain the exercise to the athlete. That's a very common way that a lot of people do it. And so, for some people, it may actually work. For people who have no experience with exercise, it generally speaking doesn't. So the first thing I'll turn to is sort of demonstration. So let's say I'm teaching a dumbbell goblet squat. I will literally just pick up a dumbbell and have the other athlete pick up a dumbbell, and I say, do what I do as I do it. So I hold the dumbbell in the goblet position, I squat, and then they squat. And then I stand up, and then they stand up, and then I say literally nothing else. And then usually it works. And if it doesn't work directly the first time, they'll at least have some sort of like, it may not look exactly like I want it to look, but it at least looks kind of like a squat. Like, for example, they're at least bending their hips and they're bending their knees. Now, whether they're bending their hips and their knees more or less is, up for whether it's debate or whether it's, they should or shouldn't do one more than the other. So let's just say they're doing the squat and they bend their hips too much. So I'll say, bend your knees more. And then I just make it very simple. Now for other movements that may be more complicated than that, let's say a good example is when I first learned how to teach a rotational med ball scoop toss at Cressey Performance. That is not like a squat or a hip hinge, or it's not a single joint movement necessarily. That's very straightforward to teach. But when I first learned to teach it, the tip that I was given is, let's relate it to something that the athletes know. When you're coming into a baseball facility, pretty much every athlete will know how to hit a baseball, like at bat. So what I would do, generally speaking, is I would have them set up next to a wall. I'd have them do a med ball or have a med ball in their hands. I'd show them the exercise and have them do it. And if they don't do it right the first 4 to 6 times, I would say, okay, stop what you're doing, put the medicine ball down at your feet, and all I want you to do is show me your batting stance. And at first, some of them would be like, what do you mean? I'd be like, no, literally pretend you're on a baseball field and show me how you would hold a bat and wind up to hit a home run. And they would do that. And then I would say, do that 2 more times, do it again. And then I would say, okay, pick the medicine ball up and do the exact same thing. And generally, like 99% of the time, it clears up perfectly. And if there's the 1% of the time that it doesn't, then we have to find other ways, whether that's using external cues, using the environment to, for example, I could say, hips face the wall completely, or pretend there's headlights on the front of your hips, that type of thing. And those must face the wall. But generally speaking, just relating something to what an athlete already knows, or maybe not even knows, but can picture in their mind using their imagination, that has worked out very, very well. Whether that's, in previous settings with collegiate athletes, with younger athletes here. I think the biggest thing, sometimes analogies are great, but sometimes athletes, if you're just throwing a bunch of words at them, it's the same thing as explaining an exercise very technically, even if it's an analogy, because the one thing to think about is, again, these are 14, 15-year-old athletes that are in a weight room for the first time or the first few times. And frankly speaking, they're just scared because they don't really know what's going on, because this is not an environment that they are comfortable in. And so to get them to be comfortable, you have to provide them the least amount of stimulus so they can slowly grade up how comfortable they can become. So sometimes I am going to provide a very basic single joint cue, bend your knees, because that's 3 words and that's all they have to think about. They don't have to think about belt buckle up to nose or, tightening the core or, vertical force production. All those are huge words for a 14 to 15-year-old athlete when all they want to do is get home and, relax after a long day of training in a professional soccer environment. So, sometimes you just need to keep it as simple as possible and not complicated for some of these athletes.
Okay, these are great. I love this conversation. I really appreciate all of the things that you've offered to myself as well as the listening audience. I'll say it over and over again. This is a very selfish project on my part with this podcast because I learn so much from the guests that I have on, and this is no exception. So, but I'm curious, Sudeep, when it comes to your goal, I'm not talking like your end goal, but the direction that you're going. Obviously you're following your heart, you're following your passion from the years that you at 11 years old watching the World Cup, and here you are working for the Seattle Sounders. And where do you want to go with this? And now granted, I know you've only been there for a couple of months, and I'm not if Brandon Moran, who's the head strength conditioning performance director at the Sounders, is listening to this, I'm not trying to get you to have his job, but if that happens, where do you want to go? What are your big, hairy, audacious goals with your career?
Yeah, that's a question that I've been asked by a lot of people in the last, I guess, 2-ish years. And if you had asked me maybe 2 years ago, I might have said I want to be a performance director at a Major League Soccer club. And I think in sort of tangible goals, I guess that is, one of the potential goals that I could be reaching towards. But again, to be quite frank with this, I don't really know. And I think not knowing what I want to do and just focusing on the next step, it has been the best decision for me in terms of where I've ended up. Like I said, I've been really lucky to learn from basically some of the best people in the world. And that was my original goal. I remember when I was in high school, I was a decent soccer player. I was one of the better players in the county. I wasn't great in terms of the overall scope of soccer in the United States, but I was good in my area. And so I wanted to play college soccer. And I remember one day, our high school team wasn't the best. Love the guys, but they weren't the greatest team. And I remember one day we basically lost like 9-1 to the best team in the area. And I was like, man, like how in the world am I going to make anything of myself? Because you're a high school kid, you don't really have perspective back then. If I'm gonna lose 9-1 to these guys. And so I remember thinking to myself, I don't really know what I'm gonna do in the long run. I didn't know what I wanted to do at the time, didn't really have any direction in terms of what I really wanted to do. I was decent in school, so I knew I would eventually find a way to get to college. Like that wasn't the challenge for me. It was more of just like, okay, what do I actually want to do with my life? And I thought, I don't really know what I want to do, but I do know this is whatever I do, I want to surround myself with the best people in the world. And I'll say that I think that goal has been achieved. My goal has always been to never be the smartest person in the room. And at Florida, I was never that. At Cressey, I was definitely never that. At the NSCA, I wasn't that. At Sporting Kansas City, wasn't that. And here at Seattle Sounders, I definitely am not that, with obviously Brandon, but then with our first team, we've got Megan Young, Adam Centofanti, Sean Muldoon. Like these guys are like really, really intelligent people and great human beings. And I think if I continue to do that, hopefully I am never the smartest person in the room so that I can continue to grow, whether that's as a performance director in an MLS club, or even if that's, again, going back to PT school. It's just, what is the next step is just doing the best that I can wherever I am, and then continue to grow and learn from the people that I'm with. So I know that's not the answer that some people want to hear, because they want to hear like, yeah, he wants to work for the national team, or he wants to work in the English Premier League. Maybe not. Maybe I'll get that opportunity one day. But whether I do or not is not necessarily the end goal. It's just to continue to get better at whatever I'm doing.
And that is the true definition of humility there, to be teachable. So I really appreciate that answer. Truly, I could learn a lot from it myself. So I would wish you really a great season, but I'm a Quakes fan, and I'm just gonna. I would have a hard time doing that, man, because I go over to, well, it used to be Avaya Stadium, but now it's PayPal, whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's one of the best MLS stadiums in the country, and we have a great time over there. But I'll try and rise above. I'm going to wish you a really good season, and I really appreciate your time. Are you an Instagram person? Do you have followers? How can people find out about your journey?
Yeah. So Instagram, what is my username? It's SBAGUY7. That's kind of more of a personal account. But you can still follow me if you want to. Generally, in terms of content, I just repost a lot smarter people than I am on my story. So if you want access to smart tips from Eric Cressey and all these other people, you can always go through my story account. But yeah, that's probably the best way to reach out. Yeah.
Right on. Well, I really appreciate your time today, and can't thank you enough.
For sure. It was great talking to you.
Well, that's another episode of the Zealous Podcast. Thanks for listening. I just want to thank Sudip for coming on. And man, for a young professional, he sure is an eloquent speaker. And even though he's being humble, he sure knows his stuff. Be sure to follow us on Instagram again, @Rocky_Snyder. Subscribe, tell some friends. That keeps on growing, and it's for listeners like you that keep spreading the word. So thank you, and we'll see you next week.